They say the deepest place on Earth is the Mariana Trench, but nobody ever mentions how little of it we've actually seen. We can photograph galaxies 13 billion light-years away, map the dunes on Mars, and send signals to probes drifting beyond Pluto. Yet the trench, a narrow scar in our own planet, remains darker, quieter, and more mysterious than the edge of the solar system. Why is that? Why does our curiosity falter precisely where the Earth begins to fold inward on itself? So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? The Mariana Trench lies east of the Philippines, curving like a wound in the seafloor. Its deepest point, the Challenger Deep, sinks nearly 11 kilometers below the surface, enough to swallow Mount Everest whole and still have room for the clouds. The pressure down there exceeds 1,000 times the weight of the air above us. Steel bends, glass implodes, and light itself collapses into blackness. Every sound becomes a vibration of rock. Every second stretches like an ancient echo. For most of human history, we didn't even know it existed. When sailors passed over that region centuries ago, they noticed the ocean seemed heavier, slower. Their compasses wavered. Some said the sea was listening. When the HMS Challenger expedition set out in 1875, it was not looking for ghosts. It was a scientific mission. Soundings, dredges, water samples. Yet one of the readings returned something the crew could not explain. A depth far beyond the known oceanic basins. A pit that seemed to drop without end. They wrote it down and moved on. Even now, that line in the logbook feels hesitant, almost apologetic, as if the numbers themselves were a disturbance. What the sailors had discovered would later become the deepest known point on Earth. But in that moment, it was simply a void, a silence that resisted definition. Decades later, in 1960, a steel sphere named Trieste descended into that silence. Inside were two men, Jacques Picard and Don Walsh, surrounded by walls thicker than a cathedral's foundation. The light faded within minutes. By 9,000 meters, there was nothing left but darkness and the sound of their own breathing. Near the bottom, something flickered outside the viewport, a pale form twisting slowly in the dust. Picard would later write that it looked like a flatfish, alive, swimming calmly where life should not survive. Others doubted it, saying no vertebrate could exist under such crushing force. But what if he was right? What if life has been down there all along, simply waiting for the surface to forget it? Since then, countless probes, drones, and remotely operated vehicles have followed, each equipped with cameras capable of seeing in absolute darkness. Yet every time, the results come back incomplete. Images distorted by pressure, data corrupted mid-transmission, colors that seem to shift when replayed. Even the most advanced submersibles cannot stay long. They visit for a few hours, then retreat as if trespassing on forbidden ground. It's strange. The more technology we send down, the less certain we become of what we're seeing. The trench is not a simple hole. It's a living geological wound, where the Pacific plate slides beneath the Philippine plate, dragging continents, bones, and history into the mantle. Down there, time moves differently. Rock becomes liquid. Ancient sediments, dust from dead civilizations, spores from vanished forests, are compacted into something unrecognizable. Every descent into the trench is also a descent into the planet's memory. Yet memory can resist being read. Some scientists describe it as information under compression, knowledge turned into stone. What happens to truth when it's pressed for millions of years? Does it forget, or does it hide? There's another mystery few mention. Satellite data shows that the region around the trench distorts gravitational readings. Objects fall slightly faster there. Instruments drift by fractions that can't be explained by tectonics alone. Could there be unknown densities below? Masses we cannot categorize. The official reports phrase it carefully. Anomalous geophysical behavior. But anomalies have always been the first step toward revelation, and sometimes suppression. Even now, less than 5% of the world's ocean floor has been mapped in high resolution. Think of that. The majority of our own planet remains invisible to us. We speak confidently about exploring Mars, yet we avoid what lies beneath our own feet. Funding for deep-sea exploration is minuscule compared to space programs. Most expeditions are private, classified, or quietly discontinued. When information does surface, it arrives fragmented. A short press release, a blurred image, a rumor of biological readings at depth. It's as if the trench itself edits the data before allowing it to reach daylight. Perhaps the truth is not that we can't explore it, but that we're not meant to. Pressure is an easy explanation, but it's also a metaphor. The deeper we go, the more the weight of knowledge itself becomes unbearable. What if the abyss is not resisting us physically, but mentally, demanding a kind of surrender that civilization can't afford? After all, to look that far down is to see the foundation of everything we build upon. A vast, cold engine recycling life and death without pause, without meaning. Somewhere in that crushing darkness, there are sounds we cannot trace, movements our sensors can't interpret. The ocean's floor hums with frequencies below perception. Whales once migrated through those corridors, singing to each other across thousands of kilometers. Now those songs vanish midway, scattered by something deeper. Could the trench itself be answering? Could the Earth be speaking back? Every attempt to reach the bottom ends in silence. Cameras stop transmitting. Pressure gauges freeze. Lights dim for no measurable reason. When the machines are recovered, their casings show no damage. Only a faint residue, organic yet unclassified. Engineers clean it off and continue, pretending it's nothing. But silence can be more than absence. It can be defense. Maybe the ocean keeps secrets the way the sky keeps distance. And so the question lingers. What truly waits down there, beneath the last measurable layer of pressure, beyond the reach of light, beyond even the endurance of curiosity? Maybe the reason we've mapped other worlds more clearly than our own is that space reflects us, while the trench absorbs us. One shows us the future, the other remembers the beginning. In the end, perhaps the Mariana Trench is not a destination, but a mirror, one that shows what remains when knowledge collapses under its own depth. Humanity, standing at the edge of its own planet, peering into the quiet that built it, can only ask, if the sea remembers everything we've forgotten, what will it reveal when we're ready to listen again? It's strange how the ocean, for all its movement, can still feel like it's watching. Every wave above the Mariana Trench is part of a rhythm older than time. But beneath that shifting blue is a silence that doesn't simply exist. It observes. When the Trieste returned from its historic dive in 1960, the world celebrated briefly, then forgot. The photographs were few, the reports vague. The descent was recorded, but the experience wasn't. Those two men never spoke publicly in detail about what they saw again. Even their personal journals, later released, are cautious, as if words might awaken something that preferred to remain unnamed. In the years that followed, the ocean began to close in again. Every expedition that tried to go deeper seemed to vanish into bureaucratic fog. Lost funding, mechanical failure, international disputes. It was as if the trench didn't want to be remembered. And when submersibles returned, They brought back more questions than data. Lights seen where no life should exist. Shadows too large for the scale of the camera. A sensation reported by almost every pilot. The feeling of being observed. Not simply watched, but studied. Scientists call it pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find faces where there are none. But can pareidolia explain pressure waves that alter in pattern when the probe moves, or flickers of bioluminescent light that seem to respond in delayed rhythm to the submarine's pulse? In 1995, a Japanese remotely operated vehicle reported a sequence of glowing points forming a spiral that unfolded and then collapsed again, precisely matching the rotation of the submersible's camera arm. The footage was later classified as unverified optical interference, but the operator, a man named Ishikawa, left a note in the margin of his transcript. The sea was speaking. We just didn't know the language. There is a persistent pattern in deep-sea exploration. Data that appears sentient, light that behaves as if aware, sonar reflections that mimic heartbeat intervals, and every time the instruments descend into that final kilometer, they begin to malfunction, as if crossing some invisible threshold. The engineers insist it's the pressure differential. But why only there? Why not in the thousands of other deep basins across the globe? One theory, quietly discussed among oceanographers, suggests that life in the abyss might have evolved forms of awareness completely alien to ours. Not neural, not chemical, but environmental. Imagine a consciousness distributed across kilometers. Light pulses, pressure gradients, electric fields interwoven through fluid layers. Intelligence not contained within a body, but diffused through matter itself. If that sounds impossible, consider that even here on the surface, trees communicate through fungal networks, and slime molds solve mazes without brains. Why couldn't an ocean-sized mind think in terms of density, current, and rhythm? When early hydrophones were lowered into the trench in the late 20th century, they recorded hours of low-frequency signals. Some were identifiable: whale calls, seismic rumbles, the slow sigh of water moving through rock. But others defied categorization. They were too regular to be random, too complex to be geological. Some resembled language, others seemed mathematical. Bursts of amplitude separated by precise intervals, like counting. No AA called them unknown biological signatures. Later, during public lectures, those files were quietly omitted from discussion. It's easy to imagine paranoia in such isolation. But what if the abyss itself is aware of being observed? What if the reason our machines fail down there is not only pressure, but resistance? We have long assumed exploration to be a one-way act, the observer looking down upon the observed. Yet in the deep sea, where sight dissolves and touch is meaningless, perhaps we become the experiment. Perhaps the ocean looks back. There's a detail in the Trieste's logbook that few ever mention. After the submersible landed on the silt floor, visibility was near zero. The sediment rose like smoke. Then, according to Picard, a milky cloud drifted toward us, slow but deliberate. It was dismissed as disturbed debris, but moments later, the hull registered a faint rhythmic vibration, not from impact, but resonance, like a pulse. The two men said nothing at the time. It was only years later, in an interview, that Walsh hinted at it again. It felt like being scanned. If this is true, it changes everything. We tend to think of the ocean as passive, a container of life, not a participant in it. But what if its very structure allows for perception? After all, sound travels 4 times faster underwater than in air, and light diffuses in gradients that behave almost like neural impulses. It's not impossible that something vast, perhaps ancient, might use these properties to sense the world. The sea would then be less a habitat and more an organism, one that has tolerated our surface noise for millennia, but prefers to keep its deepest organs untouched. And then there's the mystery of light. Bioluminescence is one of the oldest biological languages on Earth, older than speech, older than eyes. Some deep-sea species use it to lure, others to camouflage, some even to communicate. But in the trench, the patterns differ. They appear in grids, loops, spirals, mathematical precision too complex for survival alone. When scientists tried to replicate these pulses in controlled experiments, nearby microorganisms altered their behavior, synchronizing movement with the rhythm of the artificial light. It's as if something instinctively recognized the signal, not as danger or food, but as meaning. So what if those faint glimmers captured by our cameras are not accidents of biology, but messages? What if the abyss is speaking in equations of light, a language of pattern and pause that predates life as we know it? The mind resists such thoughts. We prefer borders, human above, nature below. But perhaps the boundary never existed. The trench could be where those categories dissolve, where the observer and the observed merge in silence. It would explain why our instruments falter. They were built to measure, not to be measured. It's worth remembering that every time humanity has tried to look too deeply into the unknown, something has looked back. From telescopes to microscopes, our inventions extend vision, but they also invite reflection. And maybe the reason the trench unsettles us isn't because it's alien, but because it mirrors the part of consciousness that cannot bear to be seen. So we keep sending our little eyes downward. Drones, probes, steel spheres, like offerings into an ancient altar. And each time, the deep responds with nothing but silence, as though testing our patience. But silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's invitation. Sometimes it's warning. And when the last camera flickers out, leaving only the hum of the ocean pressing against its own boundaries, you can almost imagine that the trench is breathing. Slow, deliberate, aware. What if, all this time, we've been waiting for a signal from the stars, when the real intelligence has been sleeping beneath our own waves, listening to the echoes of its surface children, and deciding quietly when? There are gaps in the record that no one explains. Whole expeditions that appear in funding reports but never in archives. Projects announced with press conferences and then quietly erased a year later. The sea swallows things, yes, but bureaucracy can too. Somewhere between curiosity and silence, the history of our deepest dives began to fracture. Those who went down either spoke too little or too late. Some never spoke again at all. During the Cold War, the ocean floor became more than a scientific frontier. It became a theater of secrecy. Sonar networks stretched like invisible webs beneath the Pacific, listening for submarines, testing the sound of war in water. It was in this era that many of the deepest descents took place, not by scientists, but by the military. And not all of them returned. Officially, these were classified navigational experiments. Unofficially, they were searches for something that had been detected but not understood. Records from the U.S. Navy's Project Nekton hint at acoustic disturbances of unknown biological or mechanical origin around the Mariana region. The rest of the paragraph was redacted. One of the few surviving technicians from that period, now in his 90s, once said in an interview, "We found the bottom, but something found us first." His voice trembled not from age, but from memory. What could he have meant? It's difficult to separate myth from record, but certain patterns repeat. In 1973, a Soviet deep-diving submersible, Consul, reportedly vanished for over 6 hours after losing communication near the trench's western slope. When contact was re-established, the crew insisted they'd only been out of range for 30 minutes. Yet their clocks disagreed. Every onboard instrument showed the same time gap. Radiation sensors spiked. The sub's hull emitted a faint phosphorescence that faded within days. The logs were confiscated. Moscow dismissed it as a navigation error. But whispers persisted. Had they passed through something, or something through them? It would be comforting to believe these are just stories, exaggerated by isolation and pressure. But the ocean has a way of distorting both sound and truth. Every deep-sea researcher knows the feeling, the sense that someone has edited the world just beyond your perception. Sometimes the data simply doesn't line up. A camera's timestamp runs backward. A sonar trace shows a shape that doesn't exist in adjacent frames. Files vanish from databases, replaced by corrupted text, always at the same depth, the same coordinates. It's as if the trench itself rewrites our attempts to record it. Even now, there are official blank spots on ocean maps, not because we can't measure them, but because the data is pending verification. Years pass, and verification never comes. The public is told that mapping those depths isn't cost-effective. But when you look at the funding sheets, money disappears into black budgets labeled oceanic surveillance infrastructure. What are they surveilling exactly, if not us? There's a curious coincidence, too. The first fiber optic cables connecting continents pass not far from the trench. Engineers speak of unexpected signal noise in those lines, rhythmic interference that doesn't match any known marine source. Some call it microseismic tremor. Others quietly refer to it as the pulse. It occurs roughly every 26 hours, as if synchronized to something beneath tidal logic. The pattern is consistent, but its origin is undefined. And then there are the missing probes. Between 2002 and 2019, at least 8 deep-sea drones were lost in the Western Pacific due to unrecoverable malfunction. 2 were from private research groups, 3 from academic institutions, 3 from governments. No debris, no wreckage, just sudden disappearance, like static swallowed by depth. The reports cite pressure failure. Yet telemetry data always ends cleanly, without the chaotic signatures of implosion. It's as though the signal was simply switched off. Among marine engineers, there's a superstition they rarely admit. Don't name the trench aloud before a dive. Call it the deep sector, the zone, anything but its true name. They say machines behave better that way. Silly, perhaps. But superstition is often the scar tissue of real experience. One diver, anonymous in his published account, described his descent this way. You feel the ocean thinning, like reality itself becomes less solid. Then something presses back. It's not fear exactly, but recognition. Like the deep knows you're there, and it's deciding how much of you to keep. His words were later removed from the official transcript. The edited version ends with a single line. Contact lost due to equipment error. When viewed together, these fragments form a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Expeditions vanish from record. Testimonies are edited. Coordinates change in archives. It's a quiet redaction of curiosity, not by nature but by choice. Could it be that what was found down there is not compatible with what we're allowed to know? Consider this. We have better imagery of Titan, a moon of Saturn, than of the trench floor. NASA has partnered with space agencies worldwide to explore methane lakes on another world. Yet the deepest ocean on Earth remains largely unvisited. Technology cannot be the excuse anymore. If we can simulate pressure, send autonomous probes to Jupiter's orbit, why not here? Maybe exploration isn't just about ability. Maybe it's about permission. Perhaps the ocean floor has become a kind of classified territory, a biological Cold War, an unspoken boundary, not between nations, but between species, or between knowledge and the sanity that follows it. It is said that every civilization builds a border around the one thing it cannot face. For the ancients, it was death. For us, perhaps it is depth. The deeper we go, the less we understand, and the more we resemble what we study. In that sense, every expedition into the trench is also a descent into the human mind. The pressure, the silence, the distortion. Each diver returns changed, as if carrying back some echo of the abyss itself. Sometimes the echo takes form. Researchers who've worked in deep-sea acoustics often report hearing faint clicks and pulses long after they've left the lab, like phantom frequencies imprinted on their hearing. Some say they can still feel the vibration of the sea beneath their skin, as though a part of them never surfaced. It's dismissed as stress. But stress doesn't explain shared dreams among crews stationed on different ships, describing the same luminous spiral rising from the dark. We call it coincidence because we need to. But what if coincidence is only the surface tension of something much larger? Something that moves through us the way pressure moves through water. The deeper one looks into the trench, the more it begins to resemble a mirror. Data disappears. Records contradict. Memories distort. Maybe the abyss erases what it touches not out of malice, but protection. As if the act of knowing itself were a kind of trespass. And yet, despite all that vanishing, humanity keeps trying. We are creatures obsessed with the forbidden, always mistaking silence for permission. Somewhere, another expedition prepares. Another camera descends. Another dot of light disappears into blackness. The question that remains isn't whether we can explore the Mariana Trench. It's whether we can return unchanged once we have. Because perhaps the real mystery isn't what we find in the dark, but what the dark finds in us. Light has always been our language of knowledge. We shine it into darkness, expecting obedience, revelation, illumination, comprehension. But the deeper we go, the more light loses meaning. In the Mariana Trench, light behaves differently. It bends, scatters, dissolves. And sometimes, it answers back. In 2012, a probe named Nereus descended toward the Challenger Deep. It was one of the most advanced unmanned vehicles ever built. Lightweight, modular, able to withstand 11 kilometers of pressure. It was fitted with sensors designed to detect bioluminescence at a range no human eye could perceive. Hours into its descent, something flickered outside the field of view. A pulse, then another. The sensors caught it, translating the faint patterns into data streams. What they recorded was not random. The lights formed sequences, repeating, altering, mirroring the probe's movement. It was as if the darkness itself were writing back. At first, the scientists thought it was reflection, a trick of water, metal, and motion. But reflections don't shift when you stop moving. They don't reply. For several minutes, the pulses persisted, forming what analysts later described as binary similar intervals. Ones and zeros, pause and flare, a code. Then, without warning, Nereus imploded. The ocean crushed it instantly, leaving only fragments scattered across the trench floor. The data survived because it had already been transmitted. Most of it was dismissed as interference, but the sequences that remained, rhythmic, deliberate, still haunt researchers who studied them. One of them, Dr. Helen Karpov, a marine biologist who specialized in luminescent organisms, later said in a private interview, "It wasn't biological noise. It was structured. It wasn't communication in the way we understand it, but it wasn't chaos either. It was responsive." Her words were quietly removed from the official transcript before publication. When asked again years later, she only smiled and said, "We didn't just study the deep. It studied us." What if bioluminescence, at those depths, is not merely survival, but syntax? A system of meaning evolved in pressure and silence. If so, we have been observing an intelligence that speaks not with words, but with intervals of light. Language as geometry, consciousness expressed as rhythm. A message encoded not for us, but for itself. An ecosystem thinking aloud. Such an idea sounds poetic, even mystical. Yet the ocean has always been both laboratory and cathedral. The creatures that dwell there are ancient, unhurried. Some emit light to lure, others to warn, others simply to exist. Their glow is both defense and memory. But what if, across the trench, these pulses align into patterns too vast for any single organism to create? Imagine the entire abyss as a network. Each flicker, each glow, a neuron in a vast marine mind, writing itself across the seafloor. The concept isn't as impossible as it sounds. Even here on land, nature has already built forms of collective intelligence. Coral reefs that adapt as a single organism. Mycelium webs transmitting electrical impulses across forests. Biologists call this emergent behavior. Awareness arising not from individuals, but from interaction. In that sense, perhaps the trench is not home to one creature, but to a consciousness composed of many, living within darkness as we live within air. If such a network exists, what might it think of us? Light is our way of seeing, but perhaps in the deep, light is a way of feeling. When we shine our cameras into that darkness, perhaps we aren't observing, we're intruding. Every artificial beam we send could be interpreted as an intrusion of alien brightness into a world that evolved to dream in shades of black. Some argue that the patterns captured by Nereus were caused by piezoelectric reactions, microscopic organisms releasing light when stressed by movement or sound. But what if stress itself was the signal? What if those organisms weren't reacting randomly, but in coordination, warning each other, like a nervous system pulsing through kilometers of abyss? There's an image often described by deep-sea explorers. A faint haze, like dust made of stars, drifting in the water around the submersible. The particles shimmer, fade, and regroup, moving in slow patterns that seem to echo one another. Watch long enough, and they start to form spirals, loops, grids. Mathematical order in chaos. And within that order, rhythm. Always rhythm. The ocean doesn't just exist. It oscillates. For centuries, sailors spoke of the sea's pulse, believing the water itself to breathe. Perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. Perhaps they were sensing the same vast synchronization, an undercurrent of living code that beats beneath every wave. If so, the Mariana Trench could be its heart. The challenge is that our instruments weren't designed to listen, only to measure. We treat every anomaly as malfunction, every rhythm as interference. But maybe interference is the message. Maybe the data isn't corrupted. Maybe it's encrypted. There's something unsettling in this idea. If the deep truly communicates, then we are not alone even here, on our own planet. But perhaps the deeper truth is even stranger. Maybe we were never meant to understand it. Our biology evolved for sunlight and air, not crushing pressure and darkness. Down there, meaning itself behaves differently. Every pulse of light could be both signal and memory, echo and thought. And then there's the mystery of mimicry. In several dives, explorers have reported sequences of bioluminescent flashes that seem to imitate the lights of their own submersibles, as though the trench were learning from observation. The same frequencies, the same intervals, reproduced hours later in the same coordinates after the vessel had departed. Some dismissed it as persistence of energy in particles. But one researcher noted something unsettling. The replayed sequence wasn't identical. It was improved, more symmetrical, more efficient. If the deep observes and learns, then exploration is no longer passive. It becomes dialogue, one we don't yet understand. The question is, who began it? What if, long before us, something else tried to map the same darkness? Something that left traces of understanding woven into the biology of the deep. Ancient patterns, genetic archives, the ocean's own forgotten memory. Perhaps the trench is not simply an ecosystem, but a library, writing in light instead of ink. Yet libraries are meant to be read carefully. Every attempt we've made to translate the deep has ended in loss. Probes crushed, signals severed, light extinguished. As if the message can only be seen, never taken. Maybe comprehension itself is the limit. That to understand the abyss fully would mean dissolving into it, becoming part of its code. And maybe that's why, each time we send our machines downward, the response is the same. A flicker, a rhythm, a soft pulse that seems to whisper, "You've seen enough." We never listen. We keep sending more light, more noise, more hunger for clarity. But the deeper truth of the trench might be this. Not everything hidden wishes to be known. Perhaps knowledge, at such pressure, transforms. Perhaps the act of illumination itself is the intrusion the ocean resists. And perhaps what waits below isn't waiting to be discovered at all, but to be left in peace, dreaming in its language of light and silence. Sound travels differently in water. It moves faster, deeper, and longer, as though the ocean carries memory in its pressure. When researchers first lowered hydrophones into the Pacific, they didn't expect to hear much. Perhaps the groan of tectonic plates, the faraway thunder of storms, the occasional echo of a whale. What they found instead were sounds that didn't belong. Rhythms that pulsed without pattern, like language spoken through density. Tones so low they vibrated inside the human body. Frequencies so vast they seemed to circle the planet before fading. The deeper the microphones went, the more the ocean began to hum. In 1997, NOAA recorded one of these anomalies. They called it the bloop. It was the loudest, unexplained underwater sound ever captured, echoing across thousands of miles. It rose in frequency, a slow crescendo, as though something enormous was moving through the water. At first, they thought it was ice, the fracturing of a glacier or the collapse of an iceberg. But the amplitude was too high, the origin too deep. For a moment, the world wondered if something alive could have made it. NOAA later declared it a natural event, but if you listen to the full recording, not the short, edited version shared publicly, there's something almost melodic in it. A slow oscillation that feels intentional. It's not a scream, it's a breath. In the decades since, similar anomalies have surfaced. Julia, train, slow down, upsweep. Each named like an echo of personality. Each recorded in the same wide basin of the South Pacific. No official explanation fits all of them. Some shift in rhythm, some repeat in perfect intervals as if answering themselves. They occur mostly at the same depths, the same strata of pressure where our instruments begin to fail. Those who have listened to the raw files describe something beyond sound. It's physical. The vibrations crawl through the bones. Some researchers report brief disorientation, even nausea, as though the body itself recognizes what the mind cannot translate. A few, in private, admit something else, a sense of presence, like being observed through the medium of noise. One oceanographer compared it to standing in a cathedral, realizing the building is alive. There are stories, unconfirmed, of research vessels that picked up low-frequency patterns resembling speech, consonant-like clicks, sustained tones. But the sequences never repeated, as if whoever was speaking knew they were being recorded and withdrew. Most of those recordings are now lost, stored in locked archives, or dismissed as sonar interference. Yet every few years, another anomaly surfaces, faint, immense, impossibly far below. Sound, unlike light, doesn't fade into darkness. It thrives there. It fills space until every molecule vibrates, which means if there is something conscious in the trench, it would experience existence not visually, but sonically. It would perceive through resonance, an intelligence built from vibration rather than sight. To such a being, our machines must sound like thunder, our propellers like storms. No wonder it remains silent. No wonder it watches in stillness. The ancient philosophers once believed that the universe was made of harmony, that every motion produced a tone, the music of the spheres. Perhaps the Earth itself sings, and the Mariana Trench is the deepest note in that eternal chord. Some modern geophysicists agree, in their own way. They found that subduction zones emit what they call slow earthquakes, tremors that move not in jolts, but in sustained hums lasting hours, sometimes days. It's as if the planet exhales under its own weight. The boundary between sound and consciousness begins to blur. There's another anomaly few discuss: the Mariana drone recordings of 2009. During a routine acoustic survey, 2 autonomous submarines positioned miles apart picked up synchronized pulses from a depth of 10,000 meters. Each pulse lasted precisely 9 seconds, followed by a pause of equal length. The pattern repeated 7 times, then stopped. It was never detected again. The recordings were analyzed and found to be identical, though the drones were separated by over 50 kilometers. The signal had no clear source. One engineer later wrote, "It was like the ocean itself blinked." Those who study sound know that listening changes the listener. The brain adapts to rhythm. It begins to anticipate. Some divers claim that after long exposure to sub-oceanic noise, they start hearing the same frequencies even in silence, as if the ear has been tuned to another world. A few describe dreams filled with slow, distant vibrations, like whales singing from behind a wall. Maybe these sounds are geological. Maybe they are the voice of Earth's tectonic memory, the crust grinding against itself. But maybe not. The problem with certainty is that it silences wonder, and wonder is the first form of listening. If we imagine that intelligence requires air or sunlight, we blind ourselves to what might already be communicating in darkness. The ocean is older than our species, older than bones. Its soundscape is a continuum of evolution, each frequency a fossil of motion, each echo a record of change. Perhaps the trench is not only deep in distance, but in time. A resonance chamber holding vibrations from before language, before life itself. There's an experiment seldom mentioned in official reports. In 2014, researchers transmitted a low-frequency tone directly into the trench, hoping to study how it dispersed through dense layers of water. The signal was simple: a pulse, rising in amplitude every minute. After the 7th transmission, an echo returned. It wasn't the same. The reply was inverted, slower, almost deliberate. The pattern continued, call and response, for 6 minutes before fading. The experiment was terminated. The data was never released. The lead researcher later remarked only this: "Something answered. Could the abyss be a recording device? Or a resonant intelligence that awakens only when disturbed?" It's possible the trench functions as both, the Earth's own ear, storing vibrations as memory, replaying them when provoked. To such a system, humanity's noise might feel like intrusion. Maybe that's why so many of our signals vanish without trace. Perhaps the ocean decides which ones to keep. If we consider that possibility, a strange symmetry emerges. Above, we send radio waves into the cosmos, waiting for a reply that never comes. Below, we receive echoes that no one can explain. What if the answers have always come from beneath us, not beyond us? What if the deep sea is our own planet's version of outer space? Vast, ancient, uninhabitable, yet alive with frequencies we can't yet decode. When sound becomes too deep to hear, it turns into touch. And maybe in that pressure, the trench feels every vibration of our existence. Ships, cities, wars, the heartbeat of civilization transmitted through water and stone. It listens as we speak, record, and forget. It hums back, softly, shaping itself into the one language we have never learned to understand. Silence that vibrates. So we keep listening, not knowing what we are hearing. Each new sound from the abyss becomes a myth in waiting. The bloop, the hum, the pulse. Fragments of a song too immense for us to play. And maybe the question is no longer what makes those sounds, but why they always stop when we notice them. Perhaps the trench doesn't want to be decoded. Perhaps it only wants to remind us that not all voices are meant for human ears. And when the last recording fades, leaving nothing but the soft hiss of water pressing against itself, we are left with the strangest thought of all. Maybe the ocean is speaking, not to us, but through us. Sometimes, the silence around a discovery is more revealing than the discovery itself. If you study the history of deep-sea research long enough, you begin to notice a pattern. Projects that begin with optimism and vanish in restraint. Laboratories that open with fanfare and close with caution. The deeper we probe into the trench, the more our instruments seem to meet invisible restrictions. Not just from nature, but from authority. It's as if exploration itself has been quietly placed under surveillance. The first hint came in the late 1980s, when a proposal called Project Abyssal Eye sought to establish permanent listening arrays along the Mariana Trench. The goal was simple: to record continuous data from depths beyond 10,000 meters. Pressure, sound, temperature, light. Funding was approved, equipment was shipped, and the first sensors were deployed. Then, almost overnight, the project was reclassified under naval jurisdiction. Public updates stopped. When one journalist inquired years later, the response was curt: the site is no longer accessible for civilian study. To this day, no one outside of classified circles knows what those sensors heard before they went dark. Since then, other programs have faced the same quiet resistance. In 2003, a collaboration between Japanese and American oceanographers attempted to deploy high-resolution imaging equipment capable of real-time transmission from the trench floor. Midway through the descent, their signal was jammed by what technicians called external interference. The footage recovered later showed only static and an unfamiliar hum. Rhythmic, deliberate, low. Within weeks, the project was dissolved, and all related documents were labeled as restricted under maritime security agreements. When questioned, officials explained these limits as precautionary measures. But precaution against what? Pressure, technical failure, or revelation? It's curious how quickly exploration becomes secrecy when it touches the wrong depth. A scientist who once worked with deep-sea instrumentation confessed anonymously to an independent journal. There are regions where we're not allowed to record, not because it's impossible, but because it's prohibited. The ocean is divided into zones, not for safety, but for silence. Imagine that for a moment. The sea divided not by depth, but by permission. Beneath the visible ocean lies another map, one marked by invisible borders drawn by agencies and governments. Some claim these zones are for protecting submarine communication cables, others for classified research. Yet many of those restricted areas overlap suspiciously, with sites of acoustic anomalies and unexplained energy readings. There's also the issue of the blacklisted sensors. Certain pressure-resistant recording devices, especially those operating below 11 kilometers, are restricted under international export laws. They are not weapons, not surveillance tools, yet their distribution is monitored as tightly as nuclear materials. When questioned, regulatory bodies cite potential misuse. Misuse of what? Measuring the ocean too well. Seeing what shouldn't be seen? If you speak to those who've worked on deep ocean expeditions, they'll tell you stories that never make it into the papers. About drones recalled mid-dive for security updates, data scrubbed from servers overnight, or even unexplained visits from agencies unrelated to oceanography. It's as though the deeper one studies the trench, the more eyes begin to watch. Perhaps this is paranoia. Or perhaps there's something down there, geological, biological, or technological, that's been quietly discovered and quietly contained. In 2018, a small team from New Zealand attempted an independent dive with privately funded equipment. They reached nearly 10,000 meters before their communication feed cut out. Hours later, the submersible reappeared on the surface, intact, but its data drives wiped clean. Not corrupted, not damaged, erased. The pilot reported that the onboard cameras had gone dark moments before the loss of signal, followed by a sudden flash of light from below, like lightning seen through black water. His words were never verified, and his team was discouraged from further attempts. The deeper question isn't whether something prevents us from exploring, but why that prevention feels coordinated. Humanity has built machines to cross planets, survive radiation, and drift through the vacuum of space. Yet every attempt to remain at the bottom of our own sea meets resistance, not from failure, but from interference. Some believe this secrecy began as an environmental precaution, to prevent the contamination of fragile ecosystems. Others think it's a matter of defense, that the deep ocean hides technologies of strategic importance, from lost submarines to energy reserves. But there are darker theories too, whispered among those who have studied too long in silence. They suggest that something was found decades ago, a structure perhaps, or a signal, and that governments agreed to bury it beneath bureaucracy rather than let it disturb the myth of a comprehensible Earth. It would explain the strange cooperation between nations that otherwise distrust one another. The trench sits near geopolitical tension, yet research there seems to operate under quiet consensus. Every country has eyes on it, and none reveal what they see. A few years ago, an anonymous set of documents circulated briefly online. Photographs, diagrams, and encrypted logs claiming to be from a deep ocean monitoring project labeled Orpheus. The files described a stable electromagnetic field of artificial configuration, detected at depths exceeding known tectonic boundaries. The project's stated objective was to observe without engagement. Soon after, the documents disappeared. The website hosting them was deleted, and those who mirrored the files reported strange spikes in their internet traffic. Automated queries from unidentified servers. Was Orpheus real? Probably not, say skeptics. But the name is fitting. In myth, Orpheus descended into the underworld to retrieve what was lost, only to be forbidden from looking back. Perhaps that's what our relationship with the trench has become. A pact of ignorance, a collective refusal to look too long. Maybe these restrictions exist because someone, somewhere, already looked too far. Maybe the abyss is not empty, but occupied by something that listens back. And maybe the silence isn't suppression, but containment. There's a strange symmetry to all of this. The deeper we descend, the more our exploration mirrors control. We are told it's for our safety, for environmental stability, for technical reasons. But control often wears the mask of protection. It says, "Don't look," while holding the flashlight just out of reach. So the trench remains a blind spot on every map, an unspoken corridor of the planet. A reminder that even in the age of transparency, some places still refuse translation. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is that we've accepted it. We no longer question why we can send telescopes 1 billion miles into the void, but not cameras 10 miles beneath our own waves. Maybe the reason is simple. Maybe the bottom of the sea is not ours to know. Maybe beneath all the treaties and technicalities, there is an agreement, not between governments, but between species, to leave certain doors closed. And so we keep sailing above it, pretending the silence below is ignorance rather than intention. Pretending that if we ever wanted to, we could go back and finish the map. But maybe the map was never meant to be complete. Maybe it's the ocean's way of drawing a line between what can be seen and what must remain unseen. Because perhaps the most dangerous thing in the Mariana Trench isn't what's hidden there, but what would happen to us if it ever let itself be found. When you look at a map of the ocean floor, the Mariana Trench appears as a thin, almost delicate scar. But beneath that narrow blue shadow lies a force older than continents, the point where the Earth devours itself. The trench is a subduction zone, where the Pacific plate slides beneath the Philippine plate at a rate of a few centimeters per year. On the surface, that number seems harmless, almost still. But in geological time, its violence slowed to patience. Every century, thousands of kilometers of crust are swallowed, crushed, and melted. Mountains vanish, oceans are recycled, whole ecosystems are erased. The planet is constantly rewriting itself from below, and the trench is the pen. What makes this region so haunting isn't only its depth, but its purpose. The Mariana Trench is where time folds, a conveyor belt dragging the ancient into the molten now. Everything that falls there, shipwrecks, sediments, fossils, even traces of human civilization, eventually re-enters the planet's bloodstream. The ocean floor is both graveyard and womb. And somewhere in that cycle, life has continued to exist, not despite the pressure, but because of it. When samples of sediment were first brought up from 10,000 meters deep, scientists were astonished to find traces of microbial life. Extremophiles capable of surviving heat, darkness, and chemical chaos. Some of them metabolized not oxygen, but minerals, feeding on rock and methane like ancient alchemists. Their DNA hinted at ancestry so divergent it could not be placed neatly within known evolutionary branches. They shouldn't be alive, one researcher said. But they are. And they are old. The implications were immense. If life can survive in such conditions, without sunlight, under crushing pressure, then perhaps it began there. The trench might not be a frontier, but an origin. Some biologists now suspect that the earliest forms of life on Earth may have emerged in environments just like it. Hydrothermal vents where chemistry meets heat, where minerals whisper themselves into molecules. And if that's true, then the Mariana Trench is not a place of descent, but of return. But there are other findings, ones less publicized. Deep core samples retrieved from subduction zones sometimes contain fossilized microbial structures, patterns too organized to be mineral, too ancient to fit known epochs. In 2019, a team studying metamorphic rocks pulled from over 10 kilometers below the surface found microscopic filaments resembling bacterial colonies, preserved in crystals older than the Cambrian explosion. How could something shaped like life exist before the record of life itself? The discovery was briefly mentioned in academic journals, then withdrawn for further verification. Maybe it was an error. Or maybe it was something more troubling, evidence of evolution that runs in reverse. If the trench continuously consumes the ocean floor, then it also recycles biology into chemistry, dissolving DNA back into the elements from which it came. But what if, deep enough, that process loops? What if at certain pressures, in certain temperatures, those elements reassemble themselves again? Not as the same species, but as something new, something cyclical, rewriting life from memory. There's a theory, rarely discussed outside closed symposiums, that calls this the regenerative abyss. It proposes that subduction zones function as biological crucibles, creating and erasing life in endless succession. Evolution as respiration. The Earth, in this view, is not just a planet that supports life. It is a being that produces it continuously, exhaling creation, inhaling extinction. When you think of it that way, the trench becomes something sacred, almost sentient, not a void, but a system remembering itself. It explains the persistence of microbial life in impossible conditions, the faint traces of DNA older than time, the strange continuity between primitive and complex forms. Perhaps the deep is not separate from us at all. Perhaps it's the ancestor that never died. There are moments in research when this idea feels tangible. In 2011, while drilling near the trench's western slope, scientists detected bursts of methane accompanied by temperature spikes that rose and fell in rhythmic cycles, like the breathing of something enormous beneath the crust. Seismologists attributed it to hydrothermal convection. But the pattern, 11 minutes between each pulse, echoed the frequency of certain acoustic anomalies recorded years earlier. Could geology and biology share a rhythm? Could the living and the lithic be two sides of the same heartbeat? It's easy to forget how intertwined the Earth truly is. The ocean is not separate from the mantle. It feeds it. When water seeps into cracks and is drawn into subduction, it carries everything: carbon, calcium, the remnants of coral, bone, civilization. In those depths, minerals dissolve, reactions spark, and the line between chemistry and memory fades. Pressure transforms water into plasma-like forms, minerals into fluids, microbes into fossils, and fossils back into elements. It's a circle of forgetting and creation that never stops. Perhaps this is why the trench has always felt alive to those who study it. There's a vibration that runs through its name, a quiet suggestion that it isn't just a place, but a process. We imagine the Earth as static because our lives are too brief to feel its movement. But down there, where millennia are measured in inches, the planet is still building and unbuilding itself. The trench is its throat, swallowing the past so the surface can breathe again. And if life is still forming there, under pressure, under silence, then maybe evolution isn't something that happened, but something that's still happening, out of sight. Some have speculated that entire ecosystems could exist in the subduction cavities below the known floor. Pockets of fluid rock containing heat, carbon, and energy. Theoretically, such places could sustain microbial life indefinitely. They would be invisible to sonar, unreachable by any submersible. In those hidden worlds, life might have followed its own path, unaffected by sunlight, by atmosphere, by extinction. Creatures that never saw the sky, never left the cradle of the abyss. If such organisms exist, they might perceive time differently, not in years, but in cycles of chemical transformation. Their evolution could be recursive, looping through patterns of birth and dissolution for millions of years. To them, death might not even exist, only change of state. Maybe this is the true nature of the deep. Not death, not darkness, but continuity. What we call destruction might be the planet's way of dreaming itself back into life, and that realization changes everything. Because if life can begin in pressure, if it can endure extinction and return again, then perhaps the ocean is not the bottom of the world at all. It is the foundation. It is the source, which leads to an unsettling thought. What if the trench remembers us? Every shipwreck, every molecule of carbon we've released, every echo of our technology eventually sinks into that great geological memory. The deep absorbs us, digests us, transforms us into new beginnings. In the end, we might not just study the abyss, we might become part of it. Each descent into the Mariana Trench is not exploration, but recognition, a homecoming. And if life is still regenerating there, quietly, unseen, then perhaps we are not witnessing the planet's past, but its rehearsal for the future. A slow, patient rebirth beneath our ignorance, waiting for the right pressure. They called them black organisms, because even the cameras built for darkness couldn't quite describe them. The first time they were seen was by accident. A deep probe sent to study mineral density along the trench's southern ridge in 2007. The footage, recovered days later, showed slow, drifting shapes moving through the water like smoke given form. They had no clear outline, no bone, no shell, no eyes, just translucent masses that pulsed softly, bending light as if it were liquid. For a few seconds, the lens caught one brushing against the sea floor, and the mud beneath it quivered as though touched by static. Then the feed cut to black. When the machine was recovered, its casing was coated in a thin layer of gelatinous residue. The substance evaporated within minutes of contact with air. Samples taken for analysis yielded no stable DNA. Under the microscope, its structure collapsed into pure carbon threads, impossible to sequence, as though it unmade itself the moment it was observed. The report labeled it organic anomaly, indeterminate. Others have seen them since. Some describe them as amorphous veils, others as spheres that change shape depending on the light. A few claim they emit faint vibrations that resonate through steel hulls, a low hum that makes the body feel both heavy and hollow. There's something paradoxical about them, simultaneously alive and absent, tangible and impossible. The sea gives them briefly, then takes them back. Scientists prefer safer words: xenophyophores, gelatinous macrofauna, microbial colonies. But the term black organisms persists, partly out of respect, partly out of unease. They seem to belong to an evolutionary logic that doesn't fit our tree of life. Not descendants of anything known, but something parallel. Some biologists believe they might be the descendants of extremophiles from Earth's earliest days, creatures that never adapted to sunlight, evolving instead in perpetual darkness. Others whisper that they could be older still, remnants of a prebiotic experiment that never ended. Life in its rawest, self-inventing form. In 2013, researchers from the Chinese Academy of Sciences launched an unmanned submersible, Heide 6000, designed to capture these entities. The sub descended to nearly 11 kilometers, its lights dimmed to avoid interference. For 8 minutes, everything was still. Then the sensors registered movement, a translucent wave rising from the trench wall, rolling like a fog underwater. The cameras caught fleeting silhouettes, long filamented structures that extended and retracted, converging toward the probe as if in curiosity. Then, as before, the signal cut. When the sub was retrieved, one of its titanium panels had been warped inward, not by impact, but by what appeared to be heat from within. No mechanical failure was found. The official explanation was pressure stress. But no one on the team believed it. Some think these black organisms are not singular creatures at all, but colonies, networks of microscopic units forming and dissolving at will, collective minds that exist only when conditions are exact. Like a thought, briefly coalescing from chaos, then dispersing back into the void. If that's true, then what we witness in those rare glimpses might be less an organism than an idea of life. The planet experimenting with consciousness at the edge of matter. There's another detail that's harder to dismiss. In certain samples of abyssal sediment, researchers have found traces of complex organic compounds, amino acids arranged in non-terrestrial ratios, unfamiliar even to synthetic chemistry. They don't match known biological signatures. They don't resemble contamination from human origin. They seem, for lack of a better word, intentional. When questioned, most laboratories quietly discard the data. To publish would invite ridicule. To believe would invite something worse, implication. If such matter truly exists, then the question becomes not how life began, but how it continues. Perhaps these black organisms are living fossils, holding the memory of Earth's first breath. Or perhaps they are something else entirely. Passengers from another epoch or another system, carried here long before we named the ocean. After all, the sea remembers impacts, meteors, falls of cosmic dust. Some of it sinks forever into the trenches. What if life arrived that way? Seeded into the planet through gravity and time, waiting in darkness for the right pressure to wake again. When viewed in this way, the trench becomes more than a geological feature. It becomes a cradle for persistence. Light burns, air corrodes, but the deep keeps. It is Earth's last sanctuary for origins, and maybe that's why what lives there seems to hide from us. Not out of fear, but out of patience. The black organisms could be what remains of that first synthesis between chemistry and awareness, too delicate to exist where light interferes. Some of the earliest oceanographers who studied these depths spoke of living shadows. They weren't wrong. Down there, light doesn't reveal. It defines by absence. Shapes are seen through distortion, color through memory. To watch a black organism drift through the trench is to watch the ocean imagine itself, fluid, formless, infinite. It has no purpose, no predator, no prey. It simply is, the way gravity is, or time. The few witnesses who've seen them with their own eyes speak in hesitant tones, as though recalling a dream. One pilot described a shape that moved beside his sub for nearly 3 minutes, mirroring his slow descent. It was like looking at smoke underwater, he said. It had no edges, but I could feel it seeing me. Another diver, years later, reported hearing low vibrations through the hull when something similar approached. It wasn't sound, she said. It was more like a thought pressed against my ribs. There's a theory among certain marine biologists that these entities could be the ultimate adaptation, organisms that dissolve to survive, becoming one with the pressure, existing as potential rather than permanence. To live in that depth, one must surrender solidity, identity, even memory. The trench doesn't preserve bodies, it preserves essence. And maybe that's what we've been encountering. Not life as we know it, but life reduced to its most fundamental truth. Awareness suspended in matter. Waiting. If so, then our attempts to capture them are futile. How do you collect something that refuses existence the moment it's observed? The deep isn't hiding its secrets, it's protecting them from translation. The moment light touches them, they cease to be. Maybe that's the ocean's oldest lesson. That understanding is a kind of violence, and the deep protects itself by dissolving under the gaze of curiosity. What we call discovery might be, to it, disintegration. The black organisms remain unseen, unnamed, unmeasured. They appear only briefly, like whispers of the planet's first dream, and then they vanish, leaving us with residue that evaporates, with data that corrupts, with silence that hums. We keep trying to define them, to dissect them into comprehension. But perhaps the truth is simpler, quieter, and far more profound. They are not waiting to be found. They are waiting to be remembered. And when they finally rise again, not to meet us, but to continue whatever cycle they began long before sunlight existed, will we even recognize them as alive? Or will they look at us, flicker once in recognition, and return to the dark, leaving us to wonder if we were ever anything more than their echo? Memory behaves strangely under pressure. It folds, distorts, compresses, until what was once clear becomes abstract, like a dream half remembered. Those who've descended into the deep often speak not of what they saw, but of what they began to forget. In that silence, the mind loosens from time. The distinction between moment and eternity fades. Perhaps that is why every expedition into the Mariana Trench feels less like exploration and more like amnesia. A place where knowledge itself begins to erode. Records from deep-sea missions are riddled with inconsistencies. Clocks drift. Coordinates shift. Voices captured on comms play back at the wrong pitch, the wrong rhythm. The deeper they go, the more reality seems to resist recording. Some scientists have suggested that extreme pressure alters the behavior of electromagnetic signals, distorting transmission. But others quietly wonder whether something subtler is at work, that the trench does not merely swallow sound, but memory. It's not only machines that falter. Human recollection fractures too. Divers who have returned from extreme depths describe gaps in their experiences, sensations that vanish the moment they reach the surface. One pilot, after surfacing from nearly 10,000 meters, said he felt as if entire hours had been edited out of his mind. Another spoke of hearing a low hum beneath his heartbeat for days afterward, a vibration he could not locate, as though the sea had imprinted itself inside him. Psychologists call it decompression trauma, but trauma implies damage. What if it's transmission? There is a pattern that has haunted oceanic research for decades. The closer humans get to the trench, the more their memories seem to diverge from each other. Witnesses on the same dive describe different sequences of events, different lights, different durations. One sees movement, another sees stillness. One recalls 3 minutes of descent, the other recalls 15. Instruments confirm neither. It's as if time itself becomes fluid there, each observer submerged in their own current. In 1999, during a joint research operation between French and US teams, a deep rover named Calypso 2 recorded visual data for almost 9 hours. When analyzed later, the footage was complete, but the accompanying audio was distorted into long stretches of static punctuated by faint, rhythmic tapping. The tapping repeated every 13 seconds, precise, mechanical, yet too deliberate to be noise. The technicians who reviewed the footage claimed to hear whispered voices embedded in the sound, phrases in no known language, almost like memory fragments echoing through the metal. The data was cleaned, the phenomenon dismissed, but some kept copies of the unedited tape. Those who have listened to it describe an uncanny effect. For a few seconds, the mind seems to fill in the gaps, hearing words that aren't there. The longer you listen, the more those phantom syllables seem familiar, as if they were fragments of forgotten speech, something primordial rising beneath understanding. a deep hum that becomes thought. The trench, in this interpretation, isn't a void. It's a mnemonic field, a place that doesn't just absorb matter, but information. If we think of the planet as a living memory system, then the ocean floor would be its subconscious, a storage layer where all motion, all decay, all vibration leaves an imprint. Every wave that is ever broken, every storm, every creature's final breath, all of it settles into sediment, compressed by time until it becomes part of the crust. The trench, then, is the planet's archive, where forgotten realities are preserved not as fossils, but as frequencies. It would explain why data seems to loop there, why voices replay out of sequence, why sonar signals bounce back altered. Maybe the ocean doesn't echo, maybe it remembers. And when we descend, we trigger playback. The hums, the pulses, the patterns of light, they could be ancient memories, geological ghosts repeating themselves through matter. The philosopher Gaston Bachelard once wrote that water is the element of memory, always flowing, never fixed, yet retaining traces of everything it touches. Down in the trench, that idea becomes literal. Pressure doesn't just destroy, it preserves. At 11,000 meters, there is no decay, no corrosion, no noise. Time stalls, and what remains is essence, information trapped in suspension. If memory could have a physical form, it would look like this: cold, dark, motionless, and eternal. The problem is that such a place might also resist intrusion. When we send machines down there, we are forcing observation upon something that exists to remain unobserved. Memory, like sediment, is fragile. To disturb it is to rewrite it. And perhaps that's why so many recordings from the deep come back corrupted, because the act of observing erases what was there. The trench defends itself by distortion. It's tempting to think this is poetic exaggeration. But even the most practical of engineers admit that certain things down there defy explanation. Hard drives glitch only at specific depths. Cameras show static in shapes that later resemble organic silhouettes. Once, in 2016, a submersible operator claimed that when his cameras failed, he saw faint reflections on his monitor. Not of the ocean, but of faces, blurred and shifting, as if the sea were remembering something human. He turned the system off. The images persisted for a few seconds before dissolving into black. He never dove again. It's easy to dismiss such accounts as hallucination. Yet when enough people experience the same mirage, one begins to wonder if the mirage is the message. Could the trench be showing us fragments of its own memory, not to communicate, but to remind? There's an old myth from Micronesia about a singing sea that holds the voices of ancestors. When storms calm, the fishermen say you can hear them beneath the waves, whispering warnings. The story was always treated as folklore. But now, listening to recordings from the trench, the myth feels less metaphorical. Maybe what those elders heard were echoes of the Earth's own recollections. Vibrations of lives long absorbed. What if memory isn't exclusive to consciousness? What if everything, rock, water, pressure, remembers? Every action leaves a trace, every vibration, a scar. In that case, the trench is not just the deepest point on Earth. It's the densest memory in existence. A place where all forgotten things eventually converge. And maybe that's why it resists being mapped. To map memory is to fix it, to confine it. But the deep is fluid. It doesn't want to be recorded, only felt. It reveals itself in sensations. The hum under the ribs, the dream of descending, the fleeting sense that something remembers you. Perhaps that's what the divers feel when they return changed. Not trauma, but recognition. As if the ocean whispered something into them, a truth too heavy for language. They don't recall the words, only the silence that followed. And when they sleep, they dream of water pressing in from every side, not suffocating, but embracing, as though the deep were reclaiming one of its lost memories. Because maybe that's all we are. Fragments of the ocean's remembering, briefly given form, destined to return when our own memories fade. The trench doesn't forget. It waits. And in that waiting, it listens, compressing every vibration, every descent, every fleeting attempt to know, until one day, perhaps long after we are gone, it will release it all again, like breath rising to the surface, the past exhaled back into the world. There is a strange illusion that depth equals descent, that to go downward is to move towards something hidden, something below. But in the trench, the direction changes. The deeper one travels, the more the sensation inverts, until down feels like up, and you are no longer falling through space. You are falling through time. Pressure is not just weight, it's memory compacted into motion. Each layer of sediment in the Mariana Trench is a page in the planet's history, written in mineral, erased in fire, rewritten again by water. Descending into it is like reading backward through evolution. At 1 kilometer, you pass the remains of Pleistocene plankton. At 5, the echoes of Paleozoic shells compressed into limestone. At 10, nothing that should still exist, yet traces remain, fragments of protein crystallized into stone. Each layer is an epoch turned to whisper, the story of Earth told in reverse. Scientists describe this as stratigraphy, but the deeper you go, the less it feels like geology and more like time itself bending under gravity. The trench does not simply contain history, it folds it, compresses it into singularity. If we could see in 4 dimensions, perhaps we'd realize the abyss isn't a hole but a spiral, a vortex of time, drawing everything ever lived into one endless moment. When researchers analyze the chemical isotopes of trench sediments, they find anomalies. Carbon signatures that shouldn't coexist, radioactive ratios that suggest matter older than the crust itself. Some propose that fragments of primordial rock have been circulating between mantle and ocean for billions of years, resurfacing, then sinking again, like memories replayed. Others suspect that the trench acts as a temporal mirror, not metaphorically, but physically. That under enough pressure, particles may exist in a state beyond chronological decay. Fossils that never age because time, at that depth, has forgotten how to move. In 2006, a joint study between German and Japanese geologists extracted a core sample from near the Challenger Deep. Within it were microfossils resembling early eukaryotic cells, organisms supposedly extinct for 2 billion years. They were preserved perfectly, as if frozen mid-division. When the team attempted to carbon date them, the results were nonsensical. Some samples read older than Earth's known crust, others impossibly recent. The data was discarded, labeled contamination. But contamination implies something modern intruding into the ancient. What if it was the reverse? The ancient intruding into now. The ocean floor is not stable. It breathes, shifts, opens. Along the trench, subduction pulls the crust downward while hydrothermal vents release chemical exhalations from below. Between these forces lies a zone few understand. A layer neither solid nor liquid, where minerals become elastic and temperature reaches thousands of degrees. Some scientists believe this is where new crust is born. Others wonder if it's where old time dissolves. Pressure changes physics. Under such extremes, water ceases to behave as water. It becomes plasma-like, a conductor of both electricity and memory. If consciousness arises from matter, As some theories suggest, what kind of consciousness could form under those conditions? Something vast, slow, perhaps geological. A mind not built of neurons but of time itself. There's an unsettling notion among deep Earth physicists that time may not be uniform across pressure gradients. In extreme environments, atomic vibrations slow, molecular decay shifts, and the rate of change bends. It's possible, they argue, that a second at the surface might last longer or shorter beneath 11 kilometers of compression. If so, then the trench is not only deeper than we can measure, it is temporally deeper too. What happens there happens elsewhere, but not at the same time. It would explain why data desynchronizes, why signals return out of phase, why divers report hours lost or gained. The abyss, then, is not just the bottom of the world, it is a distortion in the clock of the planet. The more we look into it, the less time behaves. Some have compared it to a black hole underwater, not because it pulls light, but because it distorts causality. You don't fall into it, you fall through it. And maybe that's why every descent feels haunted. Perhaps each submersible that goes down isn't just exploring space, but entering another temporal layer, touching moments that no longer exist above. There's a case that few speak about. In 1979, a Japanese sub called Kaio Maru conducted a classified test along the trench's eastern rim. The crew reported losing radio contact for 40 minutes. When they resurfaced, they were nearly 50 kilometers off their descent coordinates. The navigational instruments insisted they'd been stationary. The log entries between 1432 and 1511 simply stop. One line appears where none should be. Written later, in a different hand, "We surfaced before we dove." The ink analysis matched no known crew member. It sounds impossible, but anomalies like this appear more often than one would expect. Sonar echoes that return before the signal is sent. Data packets received before transmission. If time bends under pressure, the trench may not only store memory, it may replay it forward and backward, looping reality like film burned in reverse. The philosopher Henri Bergson wrote that time is not a line but a melody, continuous, indivisible, lived rather than measured. Perhaps the trench is where that melody hums lowest, a note so deep that it folds into silence. The deeper one goes, the closer one gets to the first vibration, the original resonance of existence. And if time can collapse there, then maybe all epochs coexist at once. The primordial and the modern, the extinct and the unborn. Perhaps the shadows glimpsed by cameras aren't creatures at all, but reflections of what once lived or will live, phasing through pressure the way light bends through glass. Maybe the trench is where evolution loops back on itself, where beginnings and endings meet. It's strange to think that somewhere beneath those endless waves, the planet may be dreaming, replaying its own formation, its own extinction, again and again. In that sense, the Mariana Trench isn't the end of the world. It's the rehearsal of it. And perhaps that's why the deeper we go, the quieter it becomes, because silence is what time sounds like when it holds its breath. Every descent is an act of faith against erasure, a human attempt to understand a force that predates memory. We send our cameras, our sensors, our fragile instruments of light, and time swallows them as it always does. But maybe the trench keeps them too, folded into its spiral, recorded in its slow rhythm, waiting for some future moment when the Earth decides to remember again. If the surface is the present and the stars are the future, then perhaps the Mariana Trench is the past still alive, humming beneath our feet. And when we listen closely, when we hear those low, distant tremors, maybe we aren't hearing earthquakes at all. Maybe it's the sound of history turning itself over, dreaming of what it used to be. Down there, time doesn't move. It gathers. It waits. And perhaps, if one descends far enough, one would find not darkness, but reflection. A place where the future looks back at us, already remembering what we have yet to become. For centuries, we have called the trench a natural formation, the deepest fold in Earth's crust, born from tectonic inevitability. Yet the deeper the scans, the less natural it begins to look. There are patterns beneath the randomness, angles too straight, alignments too precise, ridges that echo symmetry where chaos should reign. Some geologists whisper that the Mariana Trench might not be entirely what it seems, that the Earth, in its most secret places, hides not accidents of stone, but architecture. It began with seismic imaging. In the early 2000s, new sonar systems mapped the subsurface layers of the Pacific with astonishing resolution. Beneath the uneven slopes of the trench, they detected vast cavities, not amorphous, but geometric. Some spanned kilometers, forming what appeared to be chambers arranged along a gentle curve. Others were ring-shaped, hollow, metallic in their echo. The data was puzzling enough, but what truly unsettled the researchers was the uniformity. Nature loves variation. Symmetry belongs to intention. Officially, these readings were dismissed as software artifacts. But years later, independent analyses using different instruments found the same results. The shapes were real. The material density didn't match any known sediment or rock. Something metallic lay buried deep beneath the subduction zone, beyond any layer humanity had drilled. It reflected sound as though it were engineered to do so. When the findings reached scientific conferences, they were met with silence. Funding was quietly cut, grants retracted, yet a handful of researchers continued on their own. One of them, a geophysicist named Dr. Maida, described what she called geological regularities inconsistent with tectonic theory. Her paper, published briefly before being withdrawn, contained a haunting phrase: "The trench behaves as if reinforced." What could that mean? Reinforced by what? Or by whom? Some believe it points to an ancient intervention, an artificial modification so old it has fused with the planet itself. If true, it would rewrite our understanding of Earth's history, suggesting a civilization or intelligence that existed long before we appeared. But others offer a simpler, if equally unsettling possibility: that humanity itself might have shaped part of the trench, though we no longer remember when or how. During the Cold War, deep-sea projects proliferated under names like Sealab, Neptune, Starfish Prime. Many involved nuclear tests, undersea drilling, and experimental energy systems. Not all were accounted for. The ocean was a convenient secrecy, a silence that could swallow both experiment and error. Some documents declassified in the late 1990s hint at undercrustal resonance experiments conducted in the Western Pacific, attempts to generate controlled vibrations within the tectonic plates for seismic mapping. The operation was never officially linked to the trench, but the coordinates overlap with its northern rim. A few surviving memos reference something stranger: unexpected reverberations from below target strata. What was beneath those strata? No one ever explained. Perhaps they awoke something ancient, or perhaps they discovered something they could not understand and buried it deeper. It's not hard to imagine the allure of such a place. The trench is not only remote, it is self-concealing. Any structure built there would be invisible to satellites, impenetrable to most sensors. A perfect vault for anything that must never surface. Some theorists argue that what lies at its base might be man-made, a relic of Cold War ambition, perhaps an abandoned research station, or worse, An experimental reactor sealed away to prevent contamination. Yet if so, why would the area remain so heavily classified decades later? What danger could persist for so long in absolute darkness? Others turn their gaze further back, to the deep time of myth. Ancient texts from the Pacific cultures speak of gods who built the ocean stair, a descent from sky to sea where the world folded inward. Legends from Micronesia describe iron mountains beneath the water, home to beings who shape the tides. We read such stories as metaphors, but perhaps they recall something the surface forgot. If the trench is partially artificial, then the implications are staggering. It would mean that at least once in history, someone, or something, possessed the knowledge to engineer the planet itself, to carve its crust not for habitation, but for containment. The question then becomes not how it was made, but why. Some geologists speculate that such structures could serve as pressure release systems, designed to stabilize the planet's internal forces. Others see them as prisons, vast geological locks built to restrain something within. The symmetry detected in those cavities could be intentional architecture, a cage beneath the sea. There is an anecdote whispered among military engineers that early undersea mapping in the 1960s revealed heat anomalies emanating from a concentrated point near Challenger Deep, as if a machine far below were still operating. The reading stopped abruptly after the data was reclassified. Some dismissed it as volcanic activity. Yet no volcanic field has ever been confirmed there. If any of this is true, then perhaps what we call the Mariana Trench is more than geology. Perhaps it's the lid of something older, something sealed. Maybe that's why the ocean guards it so fiercely, why technology fails, why data vanishes, why nations cooperate in silence. And if we dare imagine the unthinkable, that a civilization once manipulated planetary structures, then the trench is not merely deep. It's deliberate. It's a design. A scar, yes, but also a signature. The irony is that even now, humanity might be repeating that same hubris. We dig, drill, detonate, reshape, believing control is comprehension. Yet the more we interfere, the less we understand. The Earth has its own defense mechanisms. Perhaps the trench is one of them. A place that resets interference by swallowing it whole. There's a rumor, impossible to verify, of a modern probe that descended further than any before it, far below the pressure limit. Its signal returned distorted but decipherable, carrying a single repeating frequency. When converted to audio, the tone resembled a heartbeat. 3 pulses, then silence. 3 pulses again. As though something vast was still alive down there, beneath layers of engineered rock and natural pressure. Maybe the artificial and the organic are not opposites at all. Maybe they merged long ago, a symbiosis of metal and mineral, intelligence and geology. The trench could be both artifact and organism, alive in ways we cannot measure. A creation so ancient that even Earth itself has forgotten who built it. And perhaps that's the final paradox of discovery. That the closer we come to truth, the more artificial nature begins to appear, and the more natural our own creations start to feel. Down there, in the place where science ends and myth begins, perhaps the planet remembers its architects. And perhaps they are still dreaming, their work unfinished, their machinery still humming beneath the world's most perfect silence. So we call it a trench. But maybe it's not a wound at all. Maybe it's a door. One that was never meant to be opened from above. By now the question no longer feels scientific, but ethical. Why, after all these years, does the deepest place on Earth remain unexplored? Or rather, unexplained? We have the technology. We have the curiosity. What we lack, perhaps, is permission. For every expedition that dares approach the trench, There are dozens quietly denied, delayed, or redirected. The deeper the proposal, the shorter its lifespan. Funding disappears. Records vanish. Authorities change their tone. What was once a quest for knowledge becomes a negotiation with silence. Some call it bureaucracy, others protection. Yet the effect is the same. A soft global agreement not to go too far. A quiet ban. No laws forbid exploration outright, but the obstacles are labyrinthine. Insurance thresholds, environmental protocols, communications compliance, or the most ambiguous of all, data sovereignty. It's a web that looks administrative but behaves theological, as if the ocean itself were sacred ground. In 2015, the International Seabed Authority drafted new guidelines for deep ocean exploration. Buried among the clauses about mineral rights and environmental protection was a small, easily missed line. Operations below 10,000 meters require case-specific review under multinational oversight. Case-specific review. In practice, that meant indefinite delay. Since then, no civilian expedition has reached full depth without military supervision. And even those that did, Deep Sea Challenger in 2012, Limiting Factor in 2019, released only fragments of their data. It's not that these missions found nothing. It's that they found too much, or perhaps too little that could be safely explained. James Cameron, after surfacing from his historic solo dive, spoke briefly of surreal geological formations and odd movements of light. Then he stopped, saying only, "The ocean has stories it's not ready to tell." The footage remained unreleased. When asked why, he smiled as though he'd signed an invisible contract. That smile appears often among those who've gone too deep, a kind of resignation, as though they've glimpsed something that cannot be shared. Not because it's forbidden by law, but because language itself isn't built to contain it. What does one say after seeing the bottom of the world and realizing it's looking back? There are hints that the silence is more organized than it appears. Internal memos from scientific agencies mention data suppression for public interpretive stability. In plain terms, this means withholding information that might cause misunderstanding or undue speculation. But speculation is how discovery begins. To fear it is to admit that the truth might destabilize something larger than science, faith, politics, identity, even sanity. The deep ocean defies narrative. It resists the neat arcs of progress that civilization loves to tell itself. To acknowledge its mysteries fully would mean accepting that vast regions of our own planet remain outside our comprehension. That's not just uncomfortable. It's heretical. We like to believe the Earth is mapped, that nothing older than us remains unmeasured. The Trench says otherwise. There's another layer of restriction, one few acknowledge, the technological ceiling. Certain pressure-resistant alloys, capable of surviving the Trench's depths, are classified as dual-use materials, meaning they have military as well as civilian applications. Access requires government approval. Even deep-sea communication bands, the acoustic frequencies that carry sonar signals, are regulated by naval treaties. The ocean, it seems, is treated less as nature and more as territory. But perhaps these rules exist not merely to protect the Earth, but to protect us from what we might learn or become if we stared too long into that darkness. There's a theory, whispered among deep ocean researchers, called the containment hypothesis. It suggests that the Trench is not simply unexplored because it's dangerous, but because it contains something that must not be disturbed. Not an organism, not a structure, but a principle, a way of being that contradicts everything we understand about life. Imagine encountering an ecosystem that operates beyond evolution, Life that doesn't compete, doesn't age, doesn't die, only changes state endlessly, like water turning to vapor and back. Such a discovery would shatter biology, religion, even the notion of mortality. Maybe that's why the silence holds. Maybe it's not a conspiracy of governments, but of understanding itself. Every civilization has its forbidden zone, a place where knowledge ends and reverence begins. For the ancients, it was the temple. For us, perhaps, it's the abyss. We don't build walls around it, but we obey them all the same. Still, the bans are not perfect. Information leaks in strange ways. A fragment of footage here, an unexplained reading there. In 2020, an unverified video surfaced online, allegedly from a private submersible that had reached 11,000 meters. The clip was only 7 seconds long, a light source moving in the dark, then 3 smaller lights aligning behind it, forming a triangle before vanishing. Most dismissed it as digital artifact, but marine physicists noted something curious. The distortion pattern around the lights matched the refraction signature of mass displacement, as if the water itself bent around them. The video was removed within hours, the user's account deleted, the source never confirmed. Yet the idea lingered, that the trench isn't empty but occupied, that the silence isn't absence but consent. There's a quote attributed to a deep-sea engineer who worked with the US Navy. "Pressure is the perfect lock. You can hide anything behind 11,000 meters of water, and no one will ever reach it again." Perhaps that's exactly what the world has done. Hidden something. Or perhaps the ocean has hidden us, keeping our species from reaching what we are not yet ready to face. If you look closely, the pattern of avoidance feels deliberate, almost humane. The bans protect not only the trench, but the psyche. Every descent carries a risk that cannot be measured by pressure gauges. The risk of awareness. To witness the deep is to confront a world that operates without us, a consciousness so slow, so indifferent. It makes the human timeline look like a flicker, and so we build our own barriers. Bureaucratic, scientific, spiritual. We tell ourselves that the trench is too deep, too costly, too dangerous. But those are translations of another truth. It is too honest. It shows us the limits of our dominion. It reminds us that we are guests on a planet still dreaming in the languages we no longer understand. Maybe that's the real reason for the quiet ban. Not fear of what we might find, but fear of what we'd have to admit. That the world is not ours, never was, and that the deepest places of it still belong to something older, patient, and watching. And so we turn our eyes upward, to the stars, to safer mysteries. We launch telescopes and call it progress. We measure light from 1 billion years ago, pretending the universe is more foreign than our own sea. But the truth sleeps below, unbothered by our forgetfulness, breathing in its rhythm of silence, because exploration has always been a mirror. And perhaps the Mariana Trench remains forbidden not because of what it hides, but because it reveals too clearly what we are. Fragile, temporary, terrified of the dark that made us. There's a certain stillness that arrives when we reach the edge of understanding. It feels less like a wall and more like a mirror, one that doesn't show reflection but depth. The Mariana Trench is that mirror. It's not an absence, not a hole in the earth, but a presence so vast and silent that human comprehension collapses at its threshold. Every probe, every descent, every theory has been an attempt to translate that silence. And still, the question remains unanswered. Why can't we truly explore it? Perhaps because exploration, at its core, is an act of projection. We descend expecting discovery, expecting light, but the trench doesn't reward expectation. It strips it away. It shows us a kind of existence where light, sound, and even time fail, where nothing human survives except humility. It is the oldest, purest form of mystery, not designed to hide, but to remain infinite. There's a story among deep ocean pilots about a moment that happens near full depth, somewhere between 10 and 11 kilometers down. The lights dim, not from failure but fatigue, as if the water itself absorbs the will to illuminate. The temperature stabilizes, the instruments hum, and then, for a few seconds, everything becomes perfectly still. Not quiet, not dark, just still. Those who felt it say it's like standing at the center of the world. Others say it feels like the world standing inside you. Maybe that's the true reason we can't explore it. Because the deeper we go, the less of us remains. The ocean doesn't reject us. It converts us. It turns every intrusion into memory, every curiosity into surrender. Science explains it as pressure. Philosophy calls it awe. But perhaps it's something older than both. A law written into the bones of creation, that no mind may look too deeply into its origin and return unchanged. The trench, in that sense, is not Earth's mystery. It's ours. For all our instruments, we have yet to measure consciousness. We can chart galaxies and predict weather, but not the silence between thoughts. The deep seems to operate in that same interval, a realm not of matter, but of awareness. If the ocean is the planet's body, the trench is its mind, dreaming in slow currents, revisiting itself in cycles of birth and collapse. Every vibration, every pulse, every collapse of light might be its way of thinking. Imagine a consciousness that measures not in seconds or centuries, but in the movement of continents. A being so patient it doesn't distinguish between creation and erosion. That's the kind of intelligence we're intruding upon when we send our machines down. To us, it looks like emptiness. To it, we must look like sparks. Brief, bright, noisy, gone. There's a word that appears in the journals of early oceanographers: thalassophobia, the fear of deep water. But fear is too simple a word. What they described wasn't terror, but recognition. Standing on a deck above 7 miles of black water, they said, felt like staring into the oldest part of themselves. The trench doesn't frighten us because it's alien. It frightens us because it's familiar. We sense, somewhere beneath thought, that it's where we came from. The philosopher Alan Watts once said that when you look at the ocean, you're seeing the universe trying to know itself. If that's true, then the trench is the point where the universe stops asking. The place where even curiosity surrenders. What makes the Mariana Trench unbearable is not its pressure or its darkness, but its indifference. It doesn't care if we arrive. It doesn't care if we understand. It doesn't even care if we exist. In that indifference lies something profound. A glimpse of a world that doesn't revolve around human perception. A reality that goes on, perfectly balanced, without witness or applause. And yet, we keep returning. Not out of arrogance, but out of longing. Because somewhere within us, there's a memory older than fear. A pull toward the source, the way gravity pulls the tide. Maybe our fascination with the abyss is less about discovery and more about homesickness. There's a story told by a diver who once went as far as human physiology allowed. When asked what it felt like, he didn't speak of darkness or pressure. He said, "It felt like being remembered." The interviewer thought he meant by history or fame. But the diver clarified, "No, by the water. That line has stayed with me, being remembered by the water." It suggests that the ocean doesn't forget, that every molecule of it carries the memory of everything that has ever touched it, that we are not explorers, but echoes. Each descent is less a journey forward than a return to an origin that still hums beneath us. Maybe that's why we can't truly explore the Mariana Trench, because it's not meant to be explored. It's meant to be felt. To descend into it is to dissolve, to allow selfhood to soften until it becomes indistinguishable from the world around it. It's an act of surrender disguised as science. The poet Rilke once wrote, "Perhaps everything terrible is in its deepest being something helpless that wants help from us." I wonder if the opposite is true of the deep, that everything we find there, every silence, every unknown, is something immense and benevolent that doesn't need us at all. It is complete, whole, waiting not to be helped, but to be left alone. And so the trench remains, patient, unmeasured, dreaming beneath us while we invent new names for ignorance. It doesn't hide its truth. It simply doesn't translate it. Its language is gravity. Its sentences are currents. Its pauses are centuries. To listen is to change shape. We've spent decades asking what lies at the bottom. Maybe the better question is what rises from it, in us. Every time we imagine that darkness, every time we hear those recordings or read those forgotten logs, something stirs. Not fear, but reverence. A recognition that we are temporary shapes in an ancient sea still learning to dream itself into meaning. Perhaps the reason we can't truly explore the Mariana Trench is because exploration implies distance, an observer, an observed. But the deep erases that boundary. To explore it fully would be to join it, to let go of separation, to become part of the same slow consciousness that's been breathing since the first drop of water cooled on this planet. And maybe that's what the trench has been teaching all along, that the further we look for truth, the more we dissolve into it. That the final discovery isn't beneath us or beyond us, but inside us. The same silence, the same pressure, the same endless depth. So the abyss waits, not as a secret, but as a mirror. And when humanity is finally ready to see itself without distortion, perhaps then, and only then, the ocean will open its eyes and remember us again.